Hey, what's up everyone? Alex here. So today we're gonna be starting off the advanced Othello class, and definitely we're gonna start off with some more advanced techniques, given that this is the advanced class and kind of a graduation and moving on from the beginner and intermediate class. So today we're gonna be covering a few topics. It's gonna be all about the X square, and so we're going to be covering early X square, floating X square, and also feeding early unbalanced edges. So it's kind of like three topics that are interlinked to one another. So I'm just going to be showing you how we can actually use it to your advantage. So this is going to be Endgame Techniques Part 1, but essentially some of these maneuvers you can actually trigger them as early as in the mid game so that you can actually kind of finish off the game, or once that game has been established in kind of like a fixed sequence, it's kind of like a fixed play out, such that it leads to all the way as early from the mid game in a fixed manner all the way into the end game. So yeah, I hope this lesson today will actually help you to achieve further Othello glory. So let us now take a look at the first topic, which is early X square. So the typical situation whereby you might actually choose to play an X square is when you're very comfortable and you're attacking kind of what is called as a double wall. So in this current situation, we have here balanced edge for white to the bottom, and an unbalanced edge, a 5 disc edge to the right for white. So over here, you are playing black, and you currently realize you have only 5 discs remaining on the board, which is essentially what you want because in Othello, typically the opening to the mid game, what you want to achieve is as few discs as possible, and of course, try not to expose too many of these discs out to the outside squares, since that would actually help to limit your opponent's moves. So in this particular situation, we'll call it the early X square, and I think in one of the earlier episodes we covered attacking unbalanced edges. So the typical way to attack unbalanced edges is to perhaps feed off a C square such as G8, give up the corner, and then you can immediately jump in for the wedge to try to exchange H8 corner for H1 and this entire edge. So even though you give up 6 stable discs to the bottom in this manner, you actually kind of gain 7 stable discs to the right, and also you gain tempo because you force white to actually play out, the follow up thereafter. So let's just kind of play back and talk about today's topic on early X square. So in fact, when you're attacking a double wall, which is essentially this 2 rows that you see on 7 and 8 for white, and also you can see on the G and H column for white, this is kind of like a wall whereby it's a continuous row, 2 rows of discs actually. So usually, if you have that disc at f6, which is kind of like the disc diagonally adjacent to the X square, that is also white, you can also pull off this maneuver in this early X square. So you kind of feed this. So I think in the earlier episodes, we also briefly covered about 3 out of 4 in the corner in order to gain tempo. So this is linked to that idea. So you want to play into the early X square at G7. So let's say if you play G7 right now, even if white were to play, say, D2, to try to gain back that excess at D4 to get the corner, it doesn't really matter because you can just follow up with a move as simple as maybe G8 and continue to do that X square and C square combo. So you get 2 moves in the middle. Or of course, you also have the option to play F2 to kind of like further prevent and remove the D4 disc, which is the excess for white. But what you probably don't want to consider right now is to, maybe give up more options to white. So instead, maybe a very clean way of just playing this sequence out could be to choose to G8 as well. So let's, for the sake of this lesson, let's just talk about G8 option. So if G8 is played over here, and let's say white chooses to take the corner, you realize that black has the option to actually jump into H7. So essentially, if you consider the sequence that we just ran through, you played G7 and opponent played D2, and you played G8 and opponent took the corner and you jump into H7. Essentially, in this corner region, this corner box region, out of 4 squares, you have successfully captured 3 squares. So that's 3 out of 4 in a corner. And at the same time, the early X square that you played earlier on, it's against the key point is being against two kind of like rows and columns. So there's one row over here and one column over here. So you want to make sure that that is solid and you're attacking a double wall. So that is the early X square maneuver. And after that exchange, you realize you do have that tempo after black plays after black white black. You also have the tempo to actually continue on. Let's say if you just play to H1, which may not be the ideal case because right now H1 is kind of like a spare move for you. So what you want to do is kind of just close off the options that white has to the left first before you actually advance to the right. Because all of these squares to the top right are actually exclusive regions that only you can play, but not white. So right now, if white were to play maybe b6 in order to try to preserve as many moves as possible after you've played h7, you can just continue to play around the left side area to kind of just wait for your opponent to close off all of his options before you go to from right to left. And it's kind of like in the process of building up a framework to the left such that you can wrap up the game earlier on. So that is kind of moving towards the end game in some sense, even though there are so many empty squares remaining. But because you are already winning in terms of mobility, you can actually start to look towards, kind of sweeping the end game. So let's just talk about, let's say if we were to play b5 and let's say white just goes a5, you can play c2 and white continues on with b4. So that could be a particular sequence that could follow, and then maybe you can just play d2. So white will probably just follow this way, and yeah, you can actually just kind of wrap up the game to some extent. So let's say if you were to just grab the corner, white goes in, white essentially only has one choice. You take the corner, and then you can kind of like wrap up the game. So yeah, essentially this kind of ends up in a situation whereby from that early X square that you played to G7 due to your opponent's limited options, the way you wrap up the game would actually help you all the way from the mid game into the end game to complete the game. So let's say right now white just plays this move, you just grab G1. So yeah, kind of in conjunction with the endgame series that I've produced recently, this is slowly moving into kind of like a 5 empty squares puzzle. So what you want to do is kind of like just to run through the sequence. Let's say if you were to play a7, it's kind of like beneficial for you right now, but at the same time you give your opponent a potential to swindle. So you probably wouldn't want to do a7. Instead, what you want to do is like play g1 and force the response to g2, because if white doesn't take this and takes a7 instead, you can just take g2 and sweep another 3 more discs. So it's likely that white just defends this way, and you can just sweep the diagonal across to end the game with parity. So that's quite a straightforward win for black. And of course, if you kind of understand the early X square maneuver, you can actually gain a lot more tempo via playing that sequence instead of playing the usual C square feat. Because the C square feat essentially kind of nullifies that. If you were to play, let's say if you were to play G8 and white takes the corner and you go to H7 and white takes G7, you essentially don't really have the build up in terms of tempo, because what has happened in the lower right corner box is that you've played G8, white, and then black, white. So essentially you only get 2 out of 4 in that corner box square instead of the earlier X square maneuver whereby you get 3 out of 4. So the importance here is not really about playing X square in terms of how fancy it is, but rather in terms of the essential need that you want to actually gain tempo. Of course, you might argue that, what if white chooses to play either G8 or H7 and insists to, force you to grab only 2 out of 4 instead of 3 out of 4. But that's entirely fine. The only way that white can actually kind of force you to do that and only get 2 out of 2 tempo is to give up the corner early. So that's the power of this Xsquare. So if they give up the corner early, that's a lot more beneficial for you essentially because he surrenders the corner to the bottom right and he doesn't have any stable discs. And that's even easier for you to just sweep the disc from left or to the top, either way. So that's essentially the early Xsquare. So hopefully this early Xsquare maneuver to G7 is something that you can easily identify from now on and capitalize on. So let's move on to the floating Xsquare. So let us now talk about the floating Xsquare, which is the second point we want to cover today. So in the earlier point, we talked about the early Xsquare doing an Xsquare against a double wall, whereby there are kind of like consecutive rows on either the vertical side or the horizontal rows, and all you have to do is just go for the Xsquare and sandwich. So right now we want to talk about a bit more on a floating Xsquare whereby you don't really have that perfect 2x2 four square box and you don't have like a fully constructed wall where you can actually take advantage of a situation. So what kind of dynamics or what kind of changes happens when you actually have this empty square to c2 instead. So right now it's white's turn to play, and yeah, basically white can play b2 as well even if c2 is not black. So if c2 were black, it would be somewhat like the early x square we covered earlier on a double wall attack, but in this case c2 is an empty square, but it's still perfectly fine for you to actually engage b2 in a relatively early and floating x square. So what happens is when white plays b2, the natural response for black is to actually kind of take c2 in terms of like closing up white's options and at the same time trying to protect tempo and also in some sense playing centralized. So if white plays a feeding or a floating x square to b2 and black responds to c2, you realize that right now white has effectively kind of constructed or solidified that shape into kind of like a double wall or double unbalanced edge attack maneuver. So with that two moves being completed, white can then choose to either play a2, feed off a1 and go to b1 for the wedge and attack the right, to the top edge and also going from left to right, or white can essentially choose to play b1 and feed off a1 with a force move and then jump into a2 and then go right down to a8 for the exchange and the gain in tempo. So let's say if white were to choose a2, we go this order and white can then jump into b1 over here for the exchange, and maybe say black goes to g3, which is kind of like a natural move to actually play in terms of trying to uh, reduce as many moves that you create for your opponent and at the same time trying to keep tempo. So yeah, with that, essentially, white would have gained that advantage towards the mid game and also towards the end game. So h1 being the spare move, white can probably consider maybe d7 or yeah, essentially d7 perhaps. Probably not a great idea to play f2 and give a direct exposure of the b2 disc for black. So essentially, that is an example of the floating x square. So there could also be a situation whereby b3 is actually not occupied as well. So if b3 is an empty square as well, the same still applies. You can still play that maneuver, just that when you play b2, if let's say black takes b3, you can grab c2, or if black takes c2, you can actually grab b3. So a floating x square is kind of like an early x square to play, but it's kind of like helping you to complete the structure or the shape into a solid one, whereby you can capitalize into the C squares and feed off unbalanced edges in order to gain an exchange that is favorable for yourself. So yeah, so that is essentially the basics to floating X square, and there are many variations that you can pull off to doing so. So yeah, so over here, another example that I like to show you, a somewhat more extreme floating X square example is kind of like a stoner over here. So this is for the raccoon dog opening, and it's black to play. So over here, given that there are so many empty squares over here at B3 and C3, even though it's not a very complete and secure structure, such as the earlier point that we mentioned about the early X square and attacking two walls, you can actually still pull off somewhat like a stoner trap over here. So over here, when black plays b2, even though it is a floating x square, and with so many surrounding squares that are incomplete, you would probably expect that white would actually try to look for access to grab the corner. But given that this is like kind of like a three-disc unbalanced edge that is attackable, you can see you can see it and you can see it in action over here, whereby let's say if white were to go for maybe e6 to try to cut out a simple access of e5 to access the corner, what black could actually do is to continue to prevent it perhaps, or in fact, if black didn't want to play into the center, black could almost immediately attack d1. So this is kind of like a floating x square combined with a stoner. So you realize that after black plays d1 and threatens to capture h1 corner, you realize that if white were to take c1, white would not only flip d1 and d2, but also flip b2 this because of a3 this poisoning that move. So if this were to happen, it's essentially this is a stoner trap, and black would be able to capture the corner to a1, even with so many empty squares and an earlier floating x square executed. So let's just kind of move back over here. So let's say if black were to play this, you would realize that this is kind of like a dilemma for white, and white doesn't really have much of an option. So essentially, let's say if white were to just capture a1 corner, black would be able to capture this corner in exchange for h1. So that is kind of an extreme example of a floating x square whereby you see so many incomplete or unfilled squares around, but you can execute a similar strategy that way. So in terms of playing a floating x square, whereby you basically have quite a few squares to play to, but you kind of utilize this and the combo of d1 as kind of like a floating x square stoner trap. So with that, let's move on to the next point about feeding early unbalanced edges. So right now, let's move on to the third point for today. It's about feeding early unbalanced edges. So it's kind of like the prelude or the preparation phase of the first 2 points about playing an early x square or floating x square to kind of end off the game. So over here in this shape is kind of like the shape that was before playing the early x square. So how can you actually go about constructing that shape of a double wall? So potentially what you could do over here is to play h5 in this shape as black. Kind of feed off the edge and kind of make white construct something like a wall over here to the right and also to the bottom. So you might argue that white could potentially not choose to actually play h4, but actually choose to play maybe somewhere else, such as e3 perhaps, or even f3. So I think that is fine, but given that black has the f5 disc and allows black to actually jump into h3 to control the edge, that could actually benefit black in terms of tempo as well. So the chances are is that when you play a feeding move like this, the chances are that white would probably capture the edge. Of course, if you wanted to kind of like be a little bit more unpredictable, you would probably play something like e3 or f3 early on. But the natural sequence would be for white to actually capture h4, and then you can then just feed off this unbalanced edge early on over here for white to actually capture h2. And again, over here, if white doesn't choose to capture the edge and instead chooses to play e3 or g3, you can actually just capture the edge, which is a kind of like a balanceable edge. So if let's say white goes here, black goes h7, white goes here, in the future you can construct that access back maybe through b6 to actually capture a move to actually just kind of balance back your edge to h2. So that is a potential option. So over here, yeah, the point here is just about feeding early unbalanced edges. So this is going to be like one of the examples, and then let's take a look at another example in the form of another opening in terms of feeding early unbalanced edges to kind of like give you another variation for feeding early unbalanced edges. So the second example that I like to show for feeding early unbalanced edges stems from the opening of Raccoon Dog. So over here, there is an opportunity for black after white has played to h6, threatening the edge, to actually play something like g6. So when black plays g6 over here, instead of grabbing the edge by natural tempo, what black would actually do is just feed off this 3-disc edge such that it could be further developed into an unbalanced edge. So over here you can choose to play g6, and over here after black plays g6 and kind of sandwich in between, the natural response for white is to actually just grab the edge on h4, because if you don't grab the edge on h4 after black has passed up one tempo on the edge, and you play somewhere else, for example, maybe c6, and if black captures, h7, that tempo exchange might be a little bit too much in favor of black towards the edge. So over here, it's natural that white will want to grab the edge over here. And furthermore, this is kind of like a balanceable edge in the future, because white can potentially play h7 in the future and make it a balance edge to the top once it's been developed. So over here, it's more about feeding early unbalanced edges. So even though after white has played h4, black can actually play a very smart sequence to actually just play h3 and feed off h2, kind of forcing white to actually take the unbalanced edge, which is 5 discs. So if white were to capture h2, black can immediately slot into the Xsquare, which is also kind of like an early Xsquare. At the same time, you're feeding early unbalanced edge to kind of achieve that. So it's as early as this opening, you can actually kind of see the early feed of an unbalanced edge and an attack on it by playing an Xsquare over here to g7. So over here, you realize white loses the opportunity to kind of balance out this edge from 5 to 6, and instead right now faces kind of like a wedge potential. And if white were to capture the corner at h8, black could just simply grab h7 and attack h1 with very minimal sacrifice to the bottom and quite a lot of benefit to the top and to the right, basically. So that essentially is kind of like another way that you can feed an early unbalanced edge, just by playing a little bit early into this sequence and picturing how white may choose to respond by grabbing this balanceable edge, or this edge that seems balanceable, but in actual fact, you would probably play h3 and feed off the unbalanced edge and attack it. But over here, the key point here is you want to take note that white has this e7 disc that forces white to flip the f6 disc, which is an important access for black to be able to attack that unbalanced edge. However, you might kind of like argue against the point that white may play g3 instead. And of course, if white plays g3, black would then successfully capture this edge, a 5-disc edge, and at the same time gain tempo, and also be able to balance out the edge by playing to h2. So, yeah, that kind of concludes today's topics and episode. So, I hope you enjoyed this Endgame Techniques Part 1. And of course, the next 2 episodes will continue to look at advanced endgame techniques and how, it could actually help improve your game. So, thank you very much for joining me once again, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Goodbye.